I met the speaker tonight about 15 years or so ago, and it was because a good friend of mine said, "You gotta meet this guy, Pat. He was the teacher of my daughter, and said she had a lot of different teachers over the years, but this was the one that was the best." We were living in the San Francisco Bay Area at the time, and so I finally got around to actually calling him, and we had a great talk. And then he said, "But we're moving." So unfortunately, it's been a long distance relationship ever since, because he moved to a bunch of different schools across the country. But we've stayed in touch and gotten to know each other very well. And you're in for a treat tonight if you're interested in education at all, because he's worked really hard on this, not just the last week or two, but also for the last 20 years or so, and it's amazing. So please welcome Brian Surkan, who will talk about education.
Thanks, Pat. So, Educating for Liberty, when I decided to go full-time into teaching about 23 years ago, I thought, man, I'm going to create the Starbucks of schools. We're going to have high quality, reasonably priced education. We're going to bring education to the world. We can make this global. And then I started teaching. And then I had kids. And I realized that it's a very different beast than what I thought it was. I thought it was all about schools. And it turns out it's all about people. And so, instead of trying to solve all of the world or the country or the local state's problems in education and pontificate on top-down solutions, what I'd like to talk about tonight is rather some vignettes, both from my time as a teacher and also from my time as a father, that hopefully will help to clarify some of the lessons I've learned over the years. Perhaps the most important lesson is that every child is born with an inner teacher. And by that I mean, right from birth, that child has this drive towards independence and liberty. And you see this, if you've ever seen a little baby, they desperately want to walk, they desperately want to talk, and we don't teach them how to do that. It's the inner teacher that is really driving them to learn. And what we have to then decide is, how can we support that inner teacher in every child without extinguishing it, without blocking it from moving forward toward self-realization? And so I have been involved in quite a variety of different kinds of schools and educational structures. So if you want to ask me later in the Q&A, I'm happy to do that. But for my brief talk, I want to focus on a few examples that really cover all of the different age groups of education. So I'd like to start with the toddlers. So a few weeks ago, I was working in a toddler classroom, Montessori, 18 months to 3 years. And when you walk in, there's a remarkable shock, because you see the inner teacher at work. And so the first thing they asked me to do was to help this little boy take off his winter clothing in Chicago and get ready for the day. And so I went to him and I said, "Sam, can you go out some help?" He says, "No, I can handle this. This is a little 2-year-old." And sure enough, Sam could take off his boots. He managed to undress, put his clothes in his little cubby, get ready for the day. Throughout the course of that day, and I actually worked a few different days in the toddler program, the students took care of almost every basic need that they had. They cut their own snacks with knives. They set the table with placemats and real plates and real glasses. And when we were eating, we had family-style meals. And they would serve themselves from these little platters, and they'd pass it on to the next child, and they'd serve themselves. They'd pour their own drinks. Sam, that same day, Sam was decided that one of the jobs he wanted to do was to water the plants. So he got the little watering jug, and he went to water the plant, and he spilled along the way. So on his way back, he notices he spilled. So he puts the water jug down and gets the mop, and he mops up all his water, because everything is size. It's real, but it's their size. And then he puts the mop down, gets the water jug and continues watering. He spills some more, he switches to the mop, jug, and he is really happy. And it's tempting as an adult to see this as inefficient. This is a problem we should solve. His task is way more laborious and indirect than it should be. But it turns out that child work is not adult work. They are working to build themselves into adults, and that is really their job. We are finishing tasks. We're getting things done. And so although they are often doing things, that's really only part of what they're doing. They're building themselves. They're developing mental models. They're mastering basic skills. And so really, that whole classroom was about becoming independent. That was the nature of their job in that classroom. Moving up to elementary, I want to share a vignette from my own experience in 5th and 6th grade as a Canadian on Vancouver Island. I had this experience where I felt there was absolutely no limit to what we were allowed to achieve. There was no ceiling. And we would be allowed to go at our own pace in every single area of education. So if you were really doing well at math and we mastered this current unit, you could go up to high school math if you want. And many of us finished high school trigonometry in 5th grade. And at the same time, I had this teacher who created a sense of community. All of us cleaned the classroom. We took care of our space. It was our space. And as a result, there was this really strong sense of pride and ownership. And I'd never felt this before, and I've never had it since. So when I decided to be a teacher some years later, I went back to that teacher and I said, Mr. Shaw, what did you do? And he said, well, it's really quite simple. I threw out all of the public school curriculum, and then I decided to only include things that I saw value in, that I think would bring value to my students, ensuring that they had an unlimited upward mobility as they were ready. And that was exactly what I'd experienced, and I decided that that would be something I wanted to bring to my classrooms as a teacher as well. So moving to middle school, last year my 7th and 8th graders took me on a field trip to Washington, D.C. Now I've been on many field trips. You've likely been on some field trips of your own when you were in school. And generally it's about some adults herding children through historical educational opportunities where really the kids are all about the meals, the hotel, and their friends. And they just put up with the museums because that's what you have to do. And so my students decided they wanted to actually flip it. They wanted to plan the entire trip from start to finish. So they contacted the airlines, they got the group rates, they planned all of the ground transportation using public transportation, so they didn't need to rely on any adults to drive them anywhere. They would just come to me really to get my credit card so that they could book the flights and rent the Airbnb. They chose an Airbnb because that allowed them to have a community and to cook their own meals in the evenings. And so they really wanted to have their own experience. The itinerary every day was theirs. And many of the things they chose were similar to the ones that teachers would have chose if teachers were planning it. But it was their choice. And so as we were going through DC, even if they were going the wrong way on the blue line, I just smiled to let them have that experience of learning where they were at and how things were going. And they would make adjustments. So we bumped into the Cherry Blossom Festival, and they got together and they had a little huddle and they said, okay, let's change the itinerary. This is really exciting. How can we put this in? And there were times when we were at a museum, and most of the time, they're saying like, when can we get out of here? We've had enough. And they actually extended their stay at the museum because it was just so engaging. And they noticed that a lot of those school trips that are coming through on the buses that have that really rigid schedule, the kids weren't having much fun. They said, oh, this is kind of strange. Like, why aren't they enjoying this? And so they started to speculate among themselves. And their conclusion was, it's because the other kids didn't choose to be doing this. And so that made all the difference to them. And after experiencing that, a field trip that I had absolutely nothing to do besides providing the credit card, I don't think I'd ever want to go back and do it a different way. And as they reflected upon it, I really believe that they learned more from the process of planning and learning how to navigate the city and to interact with all of those various people and vendors than they did necessarily just from those few visits that would normally be the meat of the sandwich. So moving on to high school, I taught a science program in Massachusetts a few years ago. And this was a 6-week program that all 10th graders had to attend. They had to learn how to program in Python, how to program circuitry on a Raspberry Pi, and then there was this project at the end of the project. So 6 weeks later, they all had to produce a project. And what I had found as a teacher is that whenever I provide really rigid expectations on a rubric, the kids basically target the top of the expectations and no higher. So really what I'm doing is I'm putting a box on their inner teacher. So they're no longer reaching deep into their self-motivation to find their true creativity. So I decided not to do that. I left it wide open. And the results were astounding. Many of you as kids might have seen Space Invaders. I actually had a kid recreate Space Invaders using LED lights after 6 weeks of the programming class. Another pair of girls created a player piano. Another pair decided they would create a bot. You likely seen on the internet those little check boxes that say check here if you're human. They created a bot that could go through, pass through those check boxes to actually take all of these tests, like typing speed tests and so forth. So they were really just experimenting. How much can we do? And then there was one girl in particular that really resonates in my memory. She was one of those students that you often get as a teacher where they tell you, don't expect too much of her. She's got ADHD, she's got dysgraphia, she's got all of these problems that might impede her from being very successful in your class. And so I watched her, and when we got to the project, she stood up and she was exhausted. And she said, this week I discovered Python insomnia. And she explained that it's that particular ailment when you spend your entire week programming in Python instead of sleeping. And this girl had written thousands of lines of code and created a choose your own adventure game that was so impressive that she received a spontaneous standing ovation from the other students.
Oh, that's so cool.
And I have these constant reminders that when you just give the students and their inner teachers space and opportunities, they thrive. And often we give them these labels and we discourage them in many different ways from truly becoming their full selves. So, shifting gears slightly, I'd like to share just a few vignettes from my experiences as a father. And I'd like to have a few caveat emptors here. First of all, I didn't receive a manual of my children either. So, although you're going to hear some highlights, just know that we were bumbling through it just like all the rest of you are. But the second piece is, it's really hard to tell, as you would know yourselves if you have children or if you've seen children growing up. It's really hard to tell how much impact the education that the parents offer or the parents' parenting style has on the child versus dumb luck and personality. Who knows? And the final thing is, we tried all kinds of things with the kids in terms of parenting and also school options. So feel free to ask me later if you'd like to hear more details. But I'd like to do kind of a similar overview of a few key moments that we chose to create independent, wholesome, well-balanced children. And this is kind of it's a theme. I feel like when I go to school as a teacher, I'm really just parenting other people's kids, practicing on their kids so that I can kind of maybe get things a little better with my children. So my daughters are now both adults. When they were born, we decided that we would not put them in cribs. We decided we would simply put a mattress in the corner and prepare their rooms such that they were spaces that invited them to explore. And we didn't have no idea what we were doing. It turns out later, Maria Montessori said that's how you should do it. It was just luck, pure dumb luck. And it worked out really well because they wouldn't have to cry out for help to escape from prison, to be able to get on with their day. When they were 5, they were eligible to fly without their parents. You could pay some money to have one of the flight attendants guide them unaccompanied minor, and we immediately put them on a flight to their grandparents' place so that they would start to develop that sense of independence and feel what it was like to actually go out into the world. When they were in elementary school, they wanted a dog. I'm sure you've seen that story before. 3 weeks later, it's the parents' dog. That wasn't going to happen to us. So we said, listen, a dog is a really big responsibility, and they stay around for years. So you need to show us that you can handle that level of responsibility over time. And so we said, well, for 3 months, you're going to need to spend an hour and a half a day doing chores, which they were already doing, doing typing practice, reading about how to train a dog, because we're not training your dog, and language practice. And they did the math, and they realized that 3 months was not going to get the dog for Christmas. So they said, well, can we make you a deal? What if we doubled it all every day, 3 hours of work every day, and got the dog in a month and a half for Christmas? You're likely not going to make it, but go for it. And sure enough, they actually pulled it off. They managed to actually do all of that work every day, and they earned their dog. And they trained that puppy, and in fact, Pat has met our dog, and Mary met our dog. And she is one of the most well-trained dogs you'll ever meet. Mm-hmm. And they trained her all. They cleaned her when she got sprayed by the skunks over and over again. They truly took ownership for that dog. And actually, right now as we speak, that dog is at college in Southern Michigan State. Mm-hmm. So that dog, my daughter actually had it written into the lease when she went to college so that she could take that dog with her to college. So moving on from elementary, when they were learning to drive, we had a policy, only manual automobiles, because we wanted them to feel what it was like to connect with the car and connect with the road. Wow. And when there was a storm or ice, we would say, let's go driving. Because that was the time to go to one of those big open parking lots and practice doing donuts in the car, and teach them how to pull the handbrake when you're pulling hard left, and how to slam on the brakes, and practice all of these evasive maneuvers, because that's how you learn. And so they have now that they're they're out in the world, they've actually had to use those skills that we learned in those parking lots. And they said, Dad, thank you. It was so wonderful. So they maintain their own cars. They both drive sticks. They never want to drive an automatic. And then as they got older, they'd always been doing things around the house. It was a community. No, we don't pay you to do chores. Everyone has to contribute, kind of like my 5th grade classroom. Maybe that's where it came from. As they got into high school, they wanted more responsibility. And so they said, well, would it be all right if we did the cooking? Great, here's some credit cards. You can go and buy the groceries. We don't need to know. We trust you. And you can cook whatever you like. And we look forward to the adventure. And so all throughout high school, our daughters did all of the cooking at home. And this was during COVID. It was really a magical time. We loved COVID in our household. And so they were building up through all of these various experiences to their final trip. They wanted to have like a coming of age experience where they could kind of matriculate into adulthood fully. And so they had decided that in 2020, you might have heard that a year before, they were going to go on a 3-month trip through Europe together at 15 and 17 without any adult supervision. That was their coming of age. And so COVID came, tickets were canceled. They said, we're going to go anyway. And so they went. And they spent the 3 months in Europe. And they came back changed, as you might expect when children have those experiences. And so at every stage, they've always had that space to be independent and responsible, and to push themselves outside of their comfort zone. I asked my daughters, at some point someone asked me, so did you fight with your daughters as well when they were teenagers? Did you have that whole daughter problem that everyone seems to have? And I realized, no, we never fought with our daughters. Not in any meaningful way. And so I asked my adult daughters, I said, what happened to us? What was different in our household? And they said, Dad, you always gave us so much responsibility and independence that we were always outside of our comfort zone. We needed you as allies because we couldn't do it alone. And so it was interesting. I wonder myself whether maybe why parents struggle when their children become adolescents is because they haven't made the transition from childhood to young adulthood. And they haven't given their children that sense of responsibility and freedom. And so I'd like to leave you with one final thought, likely that surprises nobody. We won the lottery in terms of screens. We didn't have smartphones when our kids were really young, so there wasn't a temptation to use it as a babysitter. But both as a teacher and as a dad, anything you can do to minimize screen time and delay giving your children smartphones is one of the greatest gifts you can possibly give them. We ultimately gave our daughters smartphones when they went to Europe alone because we thought that at least we could give them some communication mechanisms in case they got in trouble. But ultimately, and to this day, neither of them use any social media. So again, I think it's just luck. That's just dumb luck, and that has really helped them to not suffer a lot of the consequences. If you haven't read Jonathan Haidt's the Anxious Generation, about the effects of social media and smartphones on children, especially young girls, I would strongly encourage you to read it. There are many places that are now banning smartphones in schools, but I really think that it's more our responsibility as parents to really help out in this manner. So that's essentially what I have for you. I've left out lots of details, including some of the awkward moments and things that failed dismally. But I welcome any questions or thoughts you might have about education. I've been going at this for a while, and I'm really excited about it. So I'd love to have a conversation.
Any hope that public education, and I mean public, also Christian schools, Catholic schools, blah, 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 will change because this whole standardized testing, all three of our kids, but especially our two boys, thrive on being outdoors. So I wish that the outdoor classrooms that they have now had been around when our kids were little. They would have thrived. You put a car engine in front of them, they were fixing adult golf carts at age 12 and 14.
How old are your boys?
Now they're 33 and 25, you know?
Yeah.
And they would have thrived, and they thought they were dumb in high school because they didn't fit that mold.
Yeah.
That whole meme of, you know, you put a bird on the ground, you put a monkey, you know, whatever that is, you know, you teach a monkey to fly, you
Yeah.
think he's dumb.
Yeah. I'm so sorry
And
for you.
that was dumb, and they are bright,
Yeah.
and they can do so many things, but our school system is set up for them to fail.
So I really feel for you. I think it's especially bad for boys. I think that in as much as schools serve anyone, they serve girls generally a little better than boys, mostly because girls are compliant. I think boys are the canaries in the coal mine, saying, you know, the system's not working. Like, so you might have kind of caught in between the lines that my path has led me to Montessori, and I'm an adolescent teacher. And so I am right now taking my training in Sweden to do adolescent Montessori with students who are 12 to 18. And Maria Montessori was very clear on this. She said, during the elementary years, they can consume knowledge from 6 to 12 years old at an almost unbelievable level. And I've experienced this myself. When in my first year in teaching, I was teaching 6th grade. There was no end to what they could absorb. But when they hit adolescence, you need to shift gears completely, and they should spend those first 2 years mostly working with their hands, and they should be on a farm. They should be digging in dirt. They should be learning about how the world works, how animal husbandry, and they should have responsibilities. So on this Swedish adolescent farm where I'm doing my training, they actually have, it's a school, and they have them in the States too. The the adolescents run the farm. They do all of the management, they cook all of the meals, they do all of the cleaning, they do all of the planning, they manage all of the finances, everything. Because Maria Montessori said you need to be you need to have experience out in the economic world interacting with the world. And after they spent a couple of years, 12 to 14, getting their hands dirty and really developing some adult skills such that they don't feel like they're going to fail dismally as adults, they then are much more open to learning a little more depth. Oh, I can see that it would be I'd be much better at this, managing the bees or managing the pigs if I had more knowledge. And so that's where they come back and you have this unity of head and hand. And so this separation of head and hand, and it's kind of funny you mentioned Catholic. I've actually been subbing in a Catholic school as well. And the differences between Montessori and Catholic are fascinating. But I think the solution is not top down. I think that the solution has to come from the bottom up. And so we all need to find solutions that meet our children's needs. And even though I love Montessori, and I fight, just as you heard of the field trip, most Montessori schools will not let the kids take that much ownership. But we repaired cars, they fixed the building. We had there's a rule in Montessori adolescence that the kids have to earn money. They have to have economic enterprises of some sort. And rather than me saying, we're all going to do a cafe on Friday mornings and sell coffee and donuts to parents, I said, I don't care what occupation you want to choose. You can invent whatever you want. During the first 3 weeks, they had to choose an occupation for the year. And we had 2 people that decided they were going to offer Dungeons and Dragons to the upper elementary school after school. I thought, this is a sure loser. I didn't say anything. I thought, this is never going anywhere. And there was 3 or 4 that wanted to continue doing the cafe on Friday mornings. And then there were some others who chose to do, a sticker business, and 2 of them chose to be the accountants, to manage all the money. So they went down, we drove down to the bank, they opened up an account, and I have never done any transactions in that account in my life. And so they would set up digital processing so people could pay for things using phones and without having cash. Through the course of the year, they managed those occupations every week. That Dungeons and Dragons was the most profitable enterprise that we had ever seen. When we were getting a new van for the school, our adolescents were the first to donate $1,000 from their service savings to the new school van. Wow. When the toddler classroom below us, the teacher came up to our weekly community meeting and she asked our adolescents, she knew that they had money and that they earned money. They wanted to build 2 raised beds for a butterfly garden for the little toddlers. And so she said, well, might you be willing to sponsor one of the beds and plant them both? And after they listened to her, my eldest adolescent said, no, we'll sponsor them both. And so you had these 12 to 15-year-olds, they cleared the beds, they bought the plants, and they're down there all just getting dirty in the dirt with the garden, and you've got these little toddlers watching them. And it's just what you said, they need that balance. And every Wednesday we had to go and do something with our hands. We had the mornings were just reserved. And it's hard to do when you're not on a farm. But it's human nature. We repaired cars. They practiced taking the wheels off of my car and changing the window washers on all the faculty vehicles and filling up the fluids and anything I could think of. They refinished the furniture outside. They noticed that there was a tetherball that hadn't been there for years, but there was a tetherball spike, so they voted to buy some new tetherballs for the outside, and then they had to clear the trees. They noticed that the music teacher's piano was out of tune, and so they decided to surprise him by bringing in a piano tuner secretly to tune up the music teacher's piano with their funds. And then they all sat there and watched the tuner to learn how that job is done. They all had to go and do internships for a week every year to experiment. What kind of job do I need, or do I never want to do again in my life? And that was really just part of what education should contain. And so I feel very strongly, as you might notice, that you're right, that we're losing the hands part of education. And I don't think that we should be forcing them to use their hands in a certain way. But we've got to balance out the learning, the mental, the academics with the actual hands-on work.
Because I feel like we're teaching to pass a test so that we can then pass the standardized test, so that the schools can then earn their money.
So, amen.
Yeah.
So at the Montessori school I was at last year, there were no grades. There were no tests. And so I was a little scared because I was thinking, maybe the students will not put in the effort. And we did we read the Constitution from start to finish, and then we did a mock Congress simulation. And before, it was always driven by grades and rubrics, and it was so structured. But the thing is, I was always setting a ceiling and saying, this is an A. And as soon as you set that ceiling, what you've just said is, don't bother doing any more because it's not measured. It's just waste of energy. So when I was in a scenario where there were no grades and there was no rubric, it was phenomenal. It was the best mock Congress I've ever had, and I've been doing this for decades. And yet, when they had no grades on the line and no rubric to meet and no obligation, they did it with a bigger heart and with more thoroughness than I've ever seen any class do it. There was no grade for that trip to Washington, D.C.
I compare it as an adult. I'm an RN. When I worked critical care, I could have gotten my CCRN. I said, I want to take the class to learn it, but if I'm taking it to get my certification, I'm going to study it to pass the test, not to study it to learn. That's as an adult, not as a child.
Yeah.
I'm with you. I agree. Yeah, I'm sorry about your children. And this is part of the reason why I was excited to come, because I feel like we just don't realize that we need to take action. We can't wait for some government official to fix education for us. That's not going to, they're never going to fix it. And they're never going to fix it for our kids. And so many people think, well, I'll just go Catholic, or those aren't necessarily solutions because they're all based on the same system. And so I think we need to think about different approaches to education. And we need to think more holistically about education. Other thoughts, questions, dreams?
One thing I worry about, and I love what you're saying. I can see how different kids could thrive, and I could see how some kids who don't thrive might find a door that's open for the first time. Totally understand that. But then flip over to being a boss and having those kids come into your system and having to do that. And I know that sounds kind of funny, but I think what you're saying is you're betting on getting the skills, the personal skills, to such a high level that they'll be able to cope and make decisions about whatever they face in that working world. You know what I'm saying? It's like they're rising to such a pinnacle that they have such a toolkit, to go into the world. Whereas honestly, I haven't been supervising people for several years, but for a while there, I was like, oh my God, they're not prepared. And oh my God, this is taking me more of my time to supervise them than it is to do the work myself or to do the work at all.
Yeah.
And so that obviously is a very frightening scenario. And I'm not saying everybody, but there was a trend. I had been working long enough to see the trend. But reconciling those two, where you need somebody that's coming into the work world prepared with a skill set to operate in a structure, yet they've been living in a world to develop their actualized self. Like, how do those two come together?
Great question.
I think it's actually the opposite of what you expect.
Yeah.
So I'm doing substitute teaching because I'm in the middle of this Sweden training, and it takes me away to Sweden for months or weeks in the middle of the school year, so I can't really that's why I'm no longer leading that program in Illinois as I was last year. I had to let go to do this. But last year, when we were doing the same group that went to Washington, D.C., that took me to D.C., when we learned skills, so for example, writing, there was no grades, right? So what is writing for? you've got to write for a purpose. So they had to write business cover letters and resumes. They always had to have an audience, a real world audience, because I have to make everything we do connected to the real world rather than a grade. I can't use that grade. It's on the test. Study it. It's on the test. I can't use any of that. I've got to make a justification that I'm teaching you how to adult. I am teaching you the skills you need so that you don't need me anymore. That's my role. And so at the beginning of the year, they were used to just kind of doing whatever assignment they had to do. They'd turn it in and just be done and then go into the recycling bin and then get a grade. Well, now it was, this isn't your best work. Like, you can do better. You're not going to get the job with this letter. You've got mistakes, you've got things you can improve. And so I introduced them to this whole concept of learning how to edit their own work and learning how to edit that of others. And so it became a culture of peer review of anything that you write. And to illustrate how it became so ingrained, anything that didn't have to be run by me, and very little needs to be run by the teacher. Very little. We had a parent intro to middle school for prospective families and students. And I don't need to run that. A 7th grader volunteered. So we had Allison, who was running the intro to middle school night. She invited me to make a cameo appearance and make a little speech, but she limited me to 2 minutes. So I gave her my showed her version 2 of the speech, and she said, this isn't so good. You can do better. So she sent me back, and she said, give me some tips and the things that she thought I could improve. So I go back and I do version 3 of the speech, and I come back and say, well, you've really changed it a lot, but I think if you combine version 3 and version 2 in these ways, it would be a much better version. So I go back to her with version 4, and she said, this is it. This is good enough for the presentation on Wednesday night. And so notice, do you want the kind of student working for you that just does what they're told to do at the level that they're told and waits for a rigid set of requirements? Or do you want the kind of worker who says, I know what the goal of what we're doing is, and I have some innovative ideas, and I'm going to listen to other ideas to try to make this as good as it could possibly be. And so I was incredibly proud of that night because I didn't run it, because they ran it. And so they think on their feet, they understand that they're not working for a paycheck so much as they're working to achieve some noble objective. And they then try to find innovative ways of doing that. And everything we did at the middle school was done in that manner. We had a 7th grader who spontaneously arranged to have a potluck dinner for a holiday meal. I had nothing to do with it. It just happened. And so there were decorations and everything that we had, and there's always too much food, but it was just an incredible display of magical holiday wonder that appeared because he decided that that would be a lovely thing to do. So he just took the initiative to make it happen. And so I think that in the right circumstance where you empower people, with a strong sense of grace and courtesy, which is also really important in Montessori, you actually have workers who you don't have to manage nearly as much, if at all. You basically help. You just have to share the vision and let go. And as a teacher, there's little more joyful than seeing these children just manage it on their own. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And again, I think the underpinning that I was not understanding is that there's a freedom to this model, okay? And that can be really good for the kid who has a different interest, like my brother, a very different interest, and he would have found his way versus trying, to find the path that was prescribed. Here's your prescription, go. But I think what you're saying is that through this model, the kids find this inner motivation.
It's that inner teacher.
Yeah.
And in fact, it was remarkable when I was coming into this school. I didn't want it to be my space. I wanted it to be their space. So I invited the students to come in over the summer. Who goes to school over the summer? They came in. Virtually all of them came in. I brought some ingredients from home. I placed them on the kitchen counter. I said, anyone want to make lunch? They made lovely pizza lunch for everyone. I did nothing but deposit ingredients on it. I don't even know these kids. I've never met them before in my life.
And then I said, they were looking to me for direction, saying like, how do you want us to set up the studio? I said, why are you looking to me? This is your studio. And he said, you don't need permission. I said, no, this is your studio. If you make a mistake, if you do something that doesn't work out, we can change it, we can fix it. Just try what you think. And they completely gutted the studio. And some decisions they made, I thought, that's not a great idea. They had a game room. I thought, well, why do we need a game room? It was the most useful room in that entire studio. But if I had planned it, I would not have planned that room. There was one room that I had insisted, because of feng shui, I had insisted that they not block any windows or any doors. And so the only place they could put the bookshelves in the library was in this really awkward central location that followed the rules I had imposed on them, but it was a horrible room in terms of flow. It just didn't work. And one day I realized, I was the problem with that room. I interjected myself rather than saying, make the library work. And so I came into that room and I said, the heck with feng shui, this is the corner that's going to do the least damage. I put everything in, all the shelves in the corner that were blocking, and I threw everything else on the floor. And I was going to tell them at morning meeting, I was going to invite them to reinvent the library. When the first students walked through that door, they noticed that the library was in disarray. And that there was an open invitation, implicit invitation to reinvent the library. By the time we had morning meeting, they had already reinvented it in 3 different ways and come up with their final way that they really wanted to do. And I didn't actually ask anyone to do anything. All I did was throw everything on the floor. And that was the most functional, so the 7th graders made it a 7th grade workroom. They wanted to have natural light, so they went and found a table somewhere else in the studio and put it next to the window so they could have fresh air and natural light. They also wanted to be able to have a computer there so that they could print their assignments directly in that same room. So they rebuilt a machine from the junk pile, and they formatted it, installed Windows, they found a printer, connected it, and I didn't realize why they needed a computer so close. When they're doing peer editing, they have this little spinner, like a gambling spinner, I don't know what we call it, Wheel of Fortune, and they put all the names on the spinner to see who's going to peer edit your paper. And so it was for peer editing. But I think the other thing that we're missing, and that might answer some of your question, is at the core, there was gratitude. And so at the beginning of every morning meeting, we all went around and everyone had a chance to express gratitude for something in their life. And initially in the year, I was thinking, oh man, Jane has thanked her mother for dinner 5 times in a row. And Johnny has thanked his coach, volleyball coach, twice. Like, are they taking this seriously? And I very quickly realized that set the tone for the entire day, for them to spend time every morning. And everyone wanted to participate. Nobody wanted to opt out of the gratitude. But that act of thinking about things you're grateful for set a very positive energy to the entire day. And when I met with the parents, I would periodically note, do you realize that Jane thanks you every day for the meals you cook her? And for that trip you took to Old Navy last Saturday? And for that special birthday surprise that you gave her? And mother is just astounded because Jane has never told her mother this. But Jane tells us every day. So these were sincere moments of gratitude that they were comfortable sharing with us, but they hadn't even bothered to tell their parents. And it was, I think, it created an atmosphere where there was love, and there was joy, and there was connection. And I think we lack those because we try to control the environments too much. I'm going way beyond your question.
So I have a question.
Sure.
So back to this lady's question. So is there any hope for public schools, or do we just blow them up?
So
Sorry, but I'm listening to you and thinking that the public schools do the exactly opposite of what you're talking about.
So there are public Montessori schools, for example. Wisconsin has quite a few. But even, this is one of the things that really kind of made me sad when I started teaching. let's say that you manage to convince the governor and the local school board to embrace the best possible model of education and make it a standard free education for everyone. That doesn't make it so.
I can't, yeah.
You can't replicate teachers. You can't replicate soul. It has to come from within. You can't just create an assembly line of deep, meaningful, trusting individuals to become teachers in all of these government schools. And so it doesn't really matter whether you have the best possible curriculum. This is where my Starbucks plan all fell apart. Or whether you've got some lesson plans that are really great. You've got to have people who don't get in the way of the inner teacher. And that is the hardest part of running education.
The inner teacher of the kids.
The inner teacher of every child. It is so hard. Even as a parent, I find myself tripping over my daughter's inner teacher. They put me on my place. They now know how to give me a signal. But it's just really hard. Even among teachers, when I'm with teachers, like-minded teachers, a student will be struggling with something and the teacher will intervene and solve the problem. I say, oh, they were solving this. They were having a delightful struggle. Why did you solve that problem for them? Why did you take away that opportunity for them to discover? He said, "Oh, thank you, Brian. I'm sorry, that was still stupid. I won't do it again." And it was not that I'm judging him. It's more that we're all here to try to give space. And homeschoolers face the same issue. So you can do things well in any environment if you've got the right people who understand what needs to be done. And the best solution I have is not a top-down solution, it's to just create more awareness.
Yeah.
And it's not a magic wand. It's a hard solution because I think raising children is hard. And creating the optimal environment that meets the needs of every child, that's even harder. And so I just don't have a magic bullet. I don't. But I know of solutions. It's just the implementation that is really hard. And luckily, if you're looking, you can solve the problem for your kid. Last year, when I was teaching at this middle school, my niece in France was so troubled by public education that she asked if she could come and be a foreign exchange student in my Montessori school. Montessori schools don't normally do foreign exchanges, that's not a thing. But they let her come. And it was the most magical year of her life. In fact, she was ill and she was starving herself.
Oh.
And it saved her life.
Oh.
And so when she went back, she was back in the public system. And she said, "Mom," she was telling her mother, "I just don't get it. These children don't realize that they're working for themselves. They're not working for the teacher. When the teacher leaves the room and they stop working, they're cheating themselves of their own growth. The students would never stop working when the teacher leaves the room back at the Montessori school. Why don't they understand that this isn't about pleasing the teacher? It's about building your own self." And so it was just fascinating to see her, even in just 1 year, realize what a difference that could make in perspective and understanding the nature of education and the work of the child.
So what do you see about, foresee about the possible impacts of eliminating the Department of Education?
Oh.
So anything we can do to move the decision-making closer to the parents is a good thing. I have not, without any political bias toward one political party or another, just localizing education, because nobody else cares about your kids like you do. Nobody else is going to make sure that whatever solutions they find are truly going to work for their kids. And I am also not here to say Montessori is the best solution for everyone. In fact, I've asked my daughters what they plan to do with their children. They both plan to have kids. And they have a very clear plan. Montessori when they're very young. And then they want to do homeschooling or private school for if they can find a good one, depending on local availability. And then they'd like to do public high school, which is more or less what our goddaughter's experience growing up. In fact, our youngest, when she was going to high school in one of the best high schools in Massachusetts, public schools, she couldn't actually get them to try to give her credits for the things that she had done in middle school. And so to try to negotiate, because they wouldn't listen to her, she created a fake email account and impersonated a parent so that she could actually negotiate with the school to get them, to see if she could get them to be reasonable about giving her credit for her high school credits from her private high school in Georgia. But that's kids taking initiative to try to solve the problem. The system is broken. How do we bypass the system to make things right? And when you've got more minds like that are constantly trying to find solutions, you can work around the system, but you have to at least know that there's something out there you can look for, that there's hope. You have to have hope.
Do you think that she wanted to put her kids through high school in order for the socialization aspect?
They believe, my daughters believe, that if you have a strong foundation, high school is a great opportunity for you to learn how to navigate the system.
It's an experience, yeah.
Yeah.
So they know, yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking.
We literally talked to the head of the science department at this famous public high school, and they told us, we recognize that your daughter knows all of this material because she took this exact class last year. But we don't care if she learns anything in science this year. We just want her to interact with, in the name of equity. We don't think it's fair for any student to get ahead of any other student who didn't have those opportunities. And so we think it's better that she just perhaps share some of her knowledge by being in groups with kids who don't have as much background, which translated to doing all the work for the groups. She had already experienced that enough in the few weeks at the beginning of the year. Because she knows what she's doing, but I'm done.
So it effectively didn't teach the kids anything, and she learned nothing.
No, actually taught them something that if
Yeah.
you can find someone to freeload on, like that's what
Yeah.
you do. And for her, it taught her she needs to find new ways of dealing with the situation.
Right.
And so she did. She got out of it. And so, but I think we actually have to prepare our children to have the tools to navigate a complicated world. Mm-hmm. And it's sometimes really awkward. And there are lots of times, I have lots of stories about how the girls had to navigate strange things, blockages that shouldn't have been there. But they don't resent them. For them, it was kind of like learning to be more resourceful. And both of them had that kind of similar experiences in that vein. Other questions?
You started to touch on this when you're talking about department heads in a public high school. I'd like to talk about maybe the importance of subject matter experts. I'm going to share a personal anecdote. I was in high school very interested in chemistry. Silly me, wanted to be a chemistry major at some point.
Oh, nice.
And so I was excelling in my chemistry class, but there were things that I didn't know that weren't covered in the textbook. Avogadro's number, how many atoms are in a mole? It's not in here how they figured that out. Went and talked to the teacher. How did they figure this out? Turns out she didn't know. She was a phys ed teacher.
Oh. Oh.
The gentleman that was teaching remedial math classes had a master's degree in physics and chemistry. He took me under his wing. So here's a bunch of books. Here. But how do you fix that?
So,
I think I have an idea. It probably goes back to teacher union.
well,
But I don't want to pick any fights in here.
So, I'm really glad you asked this question. So first of all, one of the reasons why my daughters wanted to go to public high school, and in fact why they really liked the private middle school that I was in. We had a fight, by the way, when they were in 8th grade. I wanted them to not be in my history class, and they wanted to be in my history class. I was charmed that my adolescent daughters wanted to be in my class, which is not usually the case. And so we'd agreed that neither of us would put in a request and they would just go where they landed. But their reason for wanting to go to public high school and to private middle schools was because they really valued the subject area mastery that their teachers had at those levels.
Now, we were lucky. We were teachers in the system. We knew how to navigate. We moved from New Hampshire. So one of our daughters went to junior year of high school in New Hampshire Public School, Dover, New Hampshire. She, within 3 months, was designated as the heir apparent for valedictorian. And she said, Dad, I gotta get out of here. I can't, they aren't going to be able to challenge me. I don't wanna be valedictorian. I wanna be challenged. And so we moved from Dover, New Hampshire to New Trier, Illinois, because she wanted subject level experts that actually knew enough to be able to bring her to the next level. And so she went from being the top of the school in New Hampshire to being middle of the pack, and she was so happy because she was looking for that. But the other part of that question is, answer the question in my opinion, there are two pieces. One is, in Montessori, they believe that you need to rediscover all of those basic things as part of your education. That means that we need to prepare the environment so that children can actually go through the discovery process of Avogadro's number, rather than just say, here's the book where it explains the history, to, in as much as possible, rediscover those basic concepts because the environment has been prepared to make it easier to discover them. You can't just say, go out into nature, good luck. And the other thing that they have now is they have access to books. And so they can actually, all of the wisdom of the past is available. Unfortunately, traditional textbooks, as you know, are pretty darn bad. They're horrible.
Well, yes, they are.
And in fact, when I first started teaching, my students, my 7th grade and 8th grade students were using a 12th grade US history textbook, and I noticed it was just full of logical fallacies. And so I said, well, this is not fair to them, because they're making conclusions without enough data. And so I said, well, we'll learn about logical fallacies. And so I taught them all of the basic traditional logical fallacies, and each of them took a 3-page section of the textbook, and they had to find 5 different kinds of logical fallacies in their section of the textbook. And so the result was, they came back and they said, we didn't think we'd find any. Do we get bonus if we find more than 5? And then they started to say, did you know they have logical fallacies on the nightly news?
Logical fallacies, what?
On the nightly news, they've got logical fallacies. Did you know that our parents are using logical fallacies on us all the time? And so these kids became almost little demons because they were aware of the fact that you can't just trust something because someone handed it to you and it's printed as some official thing. You should always be asking, do I have enough data? And when those students got to 8th grade, I didn't even issue the textbook anymore. Because at that point, there was no point. And so instead what we did, to your earlier first question, we took on the yearbook as a company. We created a company, and they then became the editors, the producers, the salesmen, the marketing. They had to apply, they had to create a resume, they had to apply for these jobs. Again, we walked across the street to the bank. The only day I ever did anything in that bank was to sign to open the account, and after that the accountants did everything. So they had to actually run the yearbook instead of dealing with a fallacy-ridden textbook. And so that, I think, taught them a lot more about life than the textbook would have. So I think there are many solutions. I think AI is ironically part of the solution for finding data, for finding sources and data that might otherwise be harder to access. But you have to teach them how to filter. How do you know what to trust? And so that's really, in my heart of hearts, I think that if we can do a great job of 0 to 8th grade education, they will have the tools necessary to go out into the world and to be able to filter it for themselves and make sense of it. But we've got to do just a superlative job of 0 to 8th grade. Because in those first years of middle school, of young adulthood, they have the mental capacity to wrestle with ambiguity, and they can develop those skills. I'm not just saying it's out of theory. I've seen it over and over again for the last 22 years. They can handle it, and then they're nobody's fool. And they will go out and they will find that, just like you did. You went and found a teacher who was going to solve that problem for you. They would do the same. My daughters
They would hang out in the science room and wait until they could get time with one of those teachers, just like you did with that remedial math teacher. And so you want to give them the empowerment to find the mentors they need to move forward. And that will be a lifelong skill that will never grow old. But public school is not going to solve it for you.
Good answer.
Any other questions?
Awesome.
Am I allowed to drink now?